Medieval Europe was a world woven from countless threads of tradition, necessity, and human nature. Picture, if you will, the continent between the years 800 and 1500, a time when life moved at the pace of walking feet and horse hooves, when the sun determined the rhythm of daily activities, and when communities were small enough that everyone knew their neighbors' names, occupations, and even their peculiar habits. In this world, laws emerged not from grand legislative assemblies as we know them today, but from the practical needs of people trying to live together in harmony. These weren't the sweeping constitutional principles that would later shape nations, but rather intimate rules about daily life, how to bake bread, where to place your pig pen, what to do when your neighbor's chickens wandered into your garden, and how to settle disputes between the baker and the miller. The medieval mind approached law differently than we do today. Where we might see arbitrary restrictions, they saw necessary guidelines for community survival. Where we might find amusing quirks, they found essential wisdom passed down through generations of trial and error. These laws tell us stories not just of legal systems, but of human communities trying to create order from the beautiful chaos of everyday existence. Consider the morning of a typical medieval town. As the church bells rang out the hours of prime, people would emerge from their timber-framed homes, their breath visible in the cool air. The baker would already have been working for hours, his ovens warming the entire neighborhood with their radiant heat. The miller would be checking his water wheel, listening to the familiar rhythm of grain being ground into flour. The blacksmith would be heating his forge, the metallic ring of hammer on anvil soon to echo through the narrow streets. But even in this peaceful scene, law was present. The baker couldn't simply make whatever bread he pleased, regulations dictated the weight, the ingredients, even the price he could charge. The miller couldn't keep whatever portion of grain he thought fair, ancient customs determined his share. The blacksmith couldn't work at any hour he chose, noise ordinances protected the sleep of neighbors who had worked hard in the fields all day. These regulations emerged from centuries of human experience. They represented the collective wisdom of communities that had learned, sometimes through bitter experience, what worked and what didn't. When you lived in a town of perhaps a few hundred people, when your survival might depend on your neighbor's goodwill during a harsh winter, when disputes couldn't be resolved by simply moving to another neighborhood, you needed clear rules that everyone understood and accepted. The authorities who created and enforced these laws were often local people, the reeve chosen by fellow villagers, the mayor elected by the town's merchants and craftsmen, the manor lord who lived among the people he governed. They weren't distant figures in marble halls, but neighbors who might share a drink with you at the local tavern, whose children played with your children, whose success or failure was intimately connected to the prosperity of the entire community. This intimacy created laws that might seem strange to our modern eyes, but which made perfect sense within their context. When everyone in town knew everyone else's business, laws about gossip and slander took on practical importance. When the community's survival depended on everyone contributing their fair share of work, laws about laziness weren't moral judgments but economic necessities. When resources were scarce and waste could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation, laws about conservation weren't environmental consciousness but simple survival. The seasons played a crucial role in medieval law. Spring brought regulations about plowing and planting, summer brought rules about harvesting and the proper treatment of growing crops, autumn brought laws about the gathering of nuts and berries and the preparation for winter, and winter brought its own set of rules about heating, lighting, and the conservation of stored food. These weren't arbitrary impositions by distant rulers, but practical guidelines that helped communities navigate the challenges of each season. Religious festivals and holy days were woven throughout the legal fabric of medieval life. Not because the law was oppressive, but because the rhythm of religious observance provided a natural framework for community life. Market days were often aligned with religious festivals because that's when people naturally gathered together. Rest days weren't just spiritual observances but practical necessities for people whose work was physically demanding. The prohibition of certain activities on holy days wasn't religious oppression but recognition that even the hardest working people needed regular respite. Trade and commerce in medieval Europe operated under systems that had evolved over generations to protect both buyers and sellers. The concept of a just price wasn't economic theory but practical wisdom. If merchants charged too much, customers couldn't afford to buy. If they charged too little, they couldn't sustain their businesses. The elaborate systems of weights and measures, the guild regulations about quality and training, the market laws about fair dealing, all of these represented communities working together to create systems that benefited everyone. As we step deeper into this medieval world, imagine yourself as a traveler approaching a prosperous market town on a warm afternoon in late spring. The sun filters through the new leaves of oak and beech trees lining the road, casting dappled shadows on the worn stone path. In the distance, you can see the town's walls rising from the gentle hillside, their gray stones warm in the afternoon light. Smoke rises from numerous chimneys, carrying with it the sense of baking bread, roasting meat, and the earthy smell of well-tended gardens. Your journey today takes you not just to a physical destination, but to an understanding of how our ancestors created order from the beautiful complexity of human community. The laws you're about to discover aren't dry legal texts but windows into the souls of people who faced the same fundamental challenges we face today: how to live together peacefully, how to ensure fairness in dealings between neighbors, how to balance individual freedom with community responsibility. As you approach the town gates, you notice the careful attention to detail that characterizes medieval life. The gates themselves are solid oak, reinforced with iron bands that show the skill of local blacksmiths. The walls are built from local stone, fitted together with such precision that mortar seems almost unnecessary. Gardens flourish in every available space, herbs growing against sunny walls, vegetables in neat rows behind houses, fruit trees trained along fence lines to make the most of limited space. The gatekeeper who greets you is a local man, perhaps a retired craftsman whose knowledge of faces and voices makes him valuable to the community. He knows every resident, every regular visitor, every merchant who comes to trade. His questions aren't bureaucratic harassment but neighborly interest. Where are you from? What brings you to town? Do you have friends or family here? This personal approach to law enforcement reflects the medieval understanding that justice works best when it's administered by people who understand the community they serve. Entering the town, you're immediately struck by the sense of purposeful activity. This isn't the frantic rush of modern urban life, but the steady, rhythmic work of people who know their crafts well and take pride in doing them properly. The cooper shapes barrel staves with strokes that seem effortless but represent decades of practice. The weaver works her loom with movements so smooth they seem like a dance. The potter shapes clay with hands that know exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly when to add water, exactly how to coax beauty from simple earth. But even this apparent simplicity is governed by intricate laws and customs. The cooper must ensure his barrels meet specific standards, they must hold the amount they claim to hold, they must be made from approved materials, they must be constructed in ways that ensure they won't leak or spoil their contents. The weaver must follow guild regulations about the quality of thread, the tightness of weave, the proper width for different types of cloth. The potter must use approved glazes, fire at approved temperatures, mark his work in ways that identify him as the maker. These regulations weren't arbitrary impositions but protections for both craftsmen and customers. When a customer bought a barrel, a piece of cloth, or a pot, they needed to know it would perform as expected. When a craftsman spent weeks creating a product, he needed to know he wouldn't be undercut by someone using inferior materials or shoddy techniques. The guild system and its associated laws created a framework where quality was rewarded, customers were protected, and honest craftsmen could make a living from their skills. The streets themselves tell stories of legal evolution. The narrow lanes weren't designed by city planners but evolved over generations as people built homes, workshops, and market stalls. The resulting layout might seem chaotic to modern eyes, but it actually represents a sophisticated understanding of how communities function. The baker is located where the smell of fresh bread can reach the maximum number of potential customers. The blacksmith is positioned where the noise of his work won't disturb those who need quiet. The well is placed where it's accessible to everyone but protected from contamination. Property laws in this medieval town reflect a deep understanding of community needs. Private ownership exists, but it's balanced with community rights. The baker owns his shop and ovens, but the community has the right to ensure he serves everyone fairly. The miller owns his mill, but the community has the right to use the stream that powers it. Homeowners can build and modify their houses, but not in ways that endanger neighbors or block public passages. Water rights provide particularly interesting examples of medieval legal thinking. The stream that runs through the town is vital to everyone. The miller needs it for power, the brewers need it for their craft, the dyers need it for their work, households need it for cooking and cleaning. Rather than allowing the first person to claim ownership of the entire stream, medieval law developed sophisticated systems for sharing this vital resource. The miller could use the water's power but had to ensure it continued flowing to those downstream. The brewers could draw water but had to maintain its quality for others. The dyers could use the stream but had to ensure their waste didn't contaminate it for household use. Market laws reveal medieval society's sophisticated understanding of economics and human nature. The concept of just price acknowledged that both buyers and sellers had legitimate interests that needed protection. Merchants couldn't charge whatever the market would bear during times of scarcity, but they also couldn't be forced to sell at prices that would bankrupt them. The elaborate systems of weights and measures, standardized across regions, ensured that a pound of grain in one town was the same as a pound of grain in another. Quality control in medieval markets was rigorous but practical. Baker's bread was regularly weighed and tested, not by bureaucrats with clipboards, but by fellow townspeople who understood both the challenges of the baker's trade and the importance of honest dealing. Brewer's ale was tasted by appointed ale tasters who knew good brewing techniques and could detect when corners were being cut. Cloth was inspected by experienced weavers who could spot inferior materials or shoddy workmanship at a glance. As afternoon settles into evening in our medieval town, the pace of life shifts into a gentler rhythm. The urgent business of the day begins to wind down, and the community prepares for the quieter activities of evening. This transition itself is governed by laws and customs that reflect centuries of wisdom about human nature and community life. The ringing of the evening bells doesn't just mark time, it signals the beginning of curfew laws that helped maintain peace and safety in an age before street lighting. Let yourself sink deeper into this world where law and daily life were seamlessly interwoven. The candlemaker begins her evening round, lighting the few public lamps that will provide guidance through the dark hours. Her work is governed by strict regulations about the quality of tallow, the size of wicks, and the proper placement of lights. These aren't bureaucratic annoyances but community safeguards. Poor quality candles could start fires that might destroy entire neighborhoods, while improperly placed lights could create shadows where thieves might hide. The tavern keeper prepares for the evening's customers, but his business operates under a complex web of laws that balance the community's desire for fellowship with its need for order. He can serve ale and wine, but not to customers who are already drunk. He can provide food and lodging, but not to known troublemakers. He can allow gaming and music, but not so loud or so late that it disturbs the sleep of neighbors. His establishment serves as an informal courthouse where disputes are often settled over a shared drink, where news is exchanged, where the unwritten laws of community behavior are reinforced through social pressure. The evening air carries the sounds of craftsmen finishing their daily work. The steady rhythm of the weaver's loom gradually slows and stops. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer fades as he banks his fires for the night. The miller secures his grain stores and checks the wooden gears of his water wheel one last time. Each of these activities is governed by laws about noise, fire safety, and the protection of valuable materials, but the laws feel natural rather than restrictive because they evolved from the practical needs of people living in close proximity. Waste disposal in medieval towns was governed by laws that seem remarkably progressive by modern standards. Householders couldn't simply throw garbage into the streets, they had to dispose of it in designated areas at specific times. Human waste had to be properly managed to prevent the spread of disease. Animal waste had to be collected and composted rather than left to rot in public areas. These laws weren't imposed by distant environmental agencies but developed by communities that understood the connection between cleanliness and health, between individual responsibility and collective well-being. The treatment of animals in medieval law reveals a sophisticated understanding of both practical and ethical considerations. Livestock had to be properly cared for not just because they were valuable property, but because their health affected the health of the entire community. Working animals like horses and oxen had to be given adequate rest and food not just because they were expensive to replace, but because overworked animals couldn't perform effectively. Even stray cats and dogs were protected by laws that recognized their role in controlling pests and providing companionship. Food safety laws in medieval towns were remarkably comprehensive and practical. Butchers had to slaughter animals in designated areas where the process could be monitored for cleanliness and proper technique. They had to dispose of waste in approved ways to prevent contamination of water sources. They couldn't sell meat from sick animals or meat that had been stored too long. These regulations weren't based on modern scientific understanding of bacteria and parasites, but on generations of observation about what practices led to illness and what practices promoted health. The guild system that governed most crafts and trades in medieval towns created laws that balanced competition with cooperation. Craftsmen were encouraged to excel in their work and to innovate within their trades, but they couldn't use techniques or materials that would give them unfair advantages over fellow guild members. Apprentices had to complete specific training periods and demonstrate specific skills before they could practice independently. Masters had to accept apprentices and teach them properly, ensuring that valuable knowledge would be passed to the next generation. Marriage and family laws in medieval communities reflected both practical necessities and deeply held values. Marriage wasn't just a personal relationship but an economic and social partnership that affected entire families and communities. Laws governed not just the wedding ceremony itself but the responsibilities of spouses to each other and to the community. Property rights within marriage were carefully defined to protect both parties while ensuring that families could function as economic units. Inheritance laws balanced the rights of children with the needs of surviving spouses and the broader community's interest in preventing disputes. The treatment of travelers and strangers was governed by laws that balanced hospitality with security. Communities had obligations to provide shelter and food to travelers in need, but they also had the right to require identification and to move along those who might cause trouble. Merchants from other towns were welcomed because they brought needed goods and valuable news, but they had to follow local laws and customs during their stay. Pilgrims were given special protection because they were engaged in religious observance, but they couldn't abuse this protection by claiming pilgrim status falsely. Educational laws in medieval communities were primarily concerned with ensuring that essential knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. Children weren't required to attend formal schools as we understand them today, but they were required to learn the skills they would need as adults. Boys learned trades from their fathers or from masters who accepted them as apprentices. Girls learned household management, textile work, and other skills from their mothers and other women in the community. Both boys and girls learned basic religious knowledge and moral principles from the local clergy. The regulation of religious practice in medieval communities was surprisingly tolerant and practical. While everyone was expected to attend church and to observe major religious festivals, individual variations in belief and practice were often accommodated as long as they didn't disrupt community harmony. Laws focused more on behavior than belief. People had to treat their neighbors fairly, fulfill their obligations to the community, and avoid actions that might bring divine displeasure on the entire community. As night deepens around our medieval town, the last of the day's business concludes and the community settles into the peaceful rhythms of evening. The narrow streets, which bustled with activity just hours ago, now host only the occasional late traveler hurrying to reach his destination, the town watch making their rounds, and cats beginning their nocturnal hunts. This is the time when the deeper wisdom of medieval law becomes most apparent, as you find yourself in a contemplative space where centuries of human experience whisper their secrets. Allow yourself to settle comfortably into this ancient world, as if you were a guest in one of the town's timber-framed houses, seated by a warm hearth while the evening unfolds around you. The laws governing this nighttime world are different from those of the day, gentler, more concerned with rest and restoration than with commerce and industry. Curfew laws don't exist to restrict freedom but to ensure that those who have worked hard during the day can sleep peacefully. Noise ordinances protect the slumber of people whose strength will be needed again when dawn comes. The night watch that patrols these streets operates under laws that balance authority with accountability. These men, often respected citizens who take turns serving their community, have the power to maintain order, but they're also bound by strict codes of conduct. They can question suspicious individuals, but they must treat everyone with courtesy. They can arrest lawbreakers, but they must be prepared to justify their actions to the community. They can enter private property in pursuit of criminals, but they must compensate property owners for any damage they cause. Inside the houses where families gather for the evening meal, domestic laws govern the complex relationships between household members. These regulations acknowledge that the family is both a unit of affection and an economic enterprise. Parents have authority over children, but they also have obligations to feed, shelter, and educate them. Servants have duties to their masters, but masters have corresponding duties to provide fair wages, adequate food, and decent treatment. Wives have responsibilities to manage households efficiently, but husbands have obligations to provide the resources necessary for that management. The medieval household was typically much larger and more complex than the nuclear families we're familiar with today. A prosperous merchant's home might include not just parents and children, but also apprentices learning the family trade, servants performing household duties, elderly relatives being cared for in their final years, and perhaps even lodgers renting space. Laws governing these complex households had to balance the rights and responsibilities of all these different people while maintaining the authority necessary for the household to function effectively. Property laws within these households reveal the medieval understanding that ownership was a bundle of rights and responsibilities rather than absolute control. The master of the house had the right to use his property as he saw fit, but he also had obligations to maintain it for future generations. He could profit from his land and buildings, but he couldn't waste resources or damage property in ways that would harm his heirs. He could exclude trespassers, but he couldn't prevent legitimate uses like gleaning rights or common grazing. The treatment of the elderly in medieval law reflects a society that valued experience and wisdom while also recognizing the practical challenges of caring for those who could no longer work. Adult children had legal obligations to care for aging parents, but these obligations were balanced with their own needs to provide for their families. Communities often stepped in to help when individual families couldn't provide adequate care. The knowledge and experience of elderly people were considered valuable community resources that deserved protection and respect. Dispute resolution in medieval communities relied heavily on mediation and arbitration rather than formal court proceedings. When neighbors disagreed about property boundaries, trade practices, or personal conduct, the first recourse was often to respected community members who could help find mutually acceptable solutions. These informal mediators weren't trained lawyers but people whose wisdom, fairness, and knowledge of local customs made them trusted arbiters. Their solutions weren't based on abstract legal principles but on practical understanding of what would work for the specific people and circumstances involved. Women's legal status in medieval society was more complex and varied than popular stereotypes suggest. While women generally couldn't hold certain public offices or practice certain trades, they had important legal rights in many areas. Married women shared in family property and had specific rights to support and inheritance. Widows often continued their husbands' businesses and could act independently in legal matters. Unmarried women of legal age could own property, enter contracts, and even become guild members in some trades. The legal treatment of children in medieval society reflected both protective instincts and practical necessities. Children had to be cared for and educated, but they also represented valuable labor and future economic security for their families. Laws governing child labor weren't based on our modern concept of protecting childhood innocence, but on ensuring that children learned useful skills while not being overworked or abused. Apprenticeship laws protected young people from exploitation while ensuring they received proper training. Economic laws in medieval communities were designed to prevent the kind of extreme inequality that could destabilize society. Usury laws limited the interest rates that could be charged on loans, preventing lenders from exploiting borrowers' desperation. Price control laws prevented merchants from taking excessive advantage of shortages. Sumptuary laws limited conspicuous consumption, ensuring that resources weren't wasted on luxury while people lacked necessities. The regulation of religious and secular festivals in medieval communities balanced spiritual needs with practical concerns. Holy days were times when work stopped and communities gathered for worship and celebration, but they were also economic opportunities for merchants and craftsmen. Laws governing festivals ensured that religious observances weren't disrupted by commercial activities, while also allowing communities to benefit economically from the gatherings that festivals created. Agricultural laws formed the backbone of medieval legal systems because agriculture formed the backbone of medieval economy. These laws governed everything from plowing and planting schedules to harvest rights and gleaning privileges. They determined when animals could graze on common lands, how water rights were allocated, and how disputes between farmers were resolved. These weren't abstract regulations imposed by distant authorities but practical rules developed by farming communities to ensure that agricultural work proceeded smoothly and fairly. As the night deepens and the medieval town settles into profound quietude, your consciousness drifts toward a deeper understanding of how these ancient laws reflected timeless truths about human nature. The gentle sounds of the night, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft footsteps of the watch making their rounds, the settling of timber in the houses around you, create a peaceful backdrop for contemplating the wisdom embedded in centuries of community experience. Let your mind settle into this contemplative space, as if you were seated in the scriptorium of a great monastery, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of generations. The manuscripts around you contain not just legal codes but insights into the human heart, how people behave when they're afraid, how they respond to fairness and unfairness, how they balance their own needs with the needs of their communities, how they seek meaning and purpose in their daily lives. The laws governing personal conduct in medieval society reveal a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Regulations about anger and violence weren't based on abstract moral principles but on practical observation of how conflicts escalated and how they could be prevented. Laws required people to cool off before pursuing grievances, recognizing that decisions made in the heat of passion rarely led to satisfactory outcomes. They established procedures for apology and reconciliation, understanding that community harmony depended on people's ability to forgive and move forward together. Sumptuary laws, regulations about clothing, food, and lifestyle, reflected medieval society's understanding that social stability required visible markers of status and role. These weren't attempts to oppress the poor or preserve aristocratic privilege, but recognition that societies function more smoothly when people can easily identify each other's roles and responsibilities. A judge needed to be recognizable as a judge, a physician as a physician, a merchant as a merchant. The laws ensured that these visual cues remained reliable while preventing the kind of ostentatious display that might create resentment or social instability. The treatment of mental illness and disability in medieval law shows both the limitations and the compassion of the age. Communities recognized that some people couldn't be held to the same standards of responsibility as others, but they struggled to define these differences clearly. Laws protected natural fools and the insane from exploitation while also protecting the community from potentially dangerous behavior. The solutions weren't sophisticated by modern standards, but they represented genuine attempts to balance compassion with safety. Marriage laws in medieval society were designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, ensuring the continuation of family lines, creating stable economic partnerships, maintaining social order, and providing appropriate care for children. The complexity of these laws reflects the complexity of human relationships and the difficulty of creating regulations that could address all the various needs and circumstances that arise in family life. Divorce was rare but not unknown, and the laws governing separation and annulment show careful attention to protecting both spouses while maintaining community stability. The regulation of alcohol consumption in medieval communities reveals a nuanced understanding of both the benefits and dangers of drinking. Ale and wine were important parts of daily life. They were often safer to drink than water, they provided necessary calories for people doing physical labor, and they facilitated the social interactions that held communities together. But laws also recognized that excessive drinking could lead to violence, neglect of responsibilities, and family breakdown. The regulations tried to preserve the benefits while minimizing the harms. Laws governing privacy and personal space in medieval communities had to balance individual needs with the practical realities of dense living. People lived much closer together than we do today, but they still needed some protection from interference and intrusion. Laws about eavesdropping, gossip, and surveillance weren't based on abstract concepts of privacy rights but on practical understanding that communities couldn't function if people felt constantly watched and judged. At the same time, the laws recognized that some level of community oversight was necessary to maintain social order. The treatment of strangers and foreigners in medieval law reflects both xenophobia and cosmopolitanism. Communities were suspicious of outsiders who might bring disease, crime, or dangerous ideas, but they were also attracted to the trade opportunities, new knowledge, and cultural enrichment that strangers could provide. Laws governing the treatment of foreigners tried to balance these competing concerns, providing protection for peaceful visitors while maintaining security for the community. Debt and credit laws in medieval society had to address the basic human needs for security and opportunity while preventing the exploitation that could result from desperate circumstances. Interest rates were regulated not just to prevent usury but to ensure that credit remained available to those who needed it. Bankruptcy laws protected debtors from complete ruin while ensuring that creditors had reasonable hope of recovering their investments. These laws recognized that economic relationships were also human relationships, and that purely commercial considerations had to be balanced with broader social concerns. The regulation of crafts and trades in medieval guilds reflected deep understanding of how people learn skills and develop expertise. Apprenticeship laws weren't just economic arrangements but educational systems designed to ensure that valuable knowledge was transmitted effectively from one generation to the next. The long periods of training required weren't arbitrary obstacles but recognition that true mastery takes time to develop. The regulations governing the relationship between masters and apprentices tried to ensure that young people received proper education while protecting them from exploitation. Environmental laws in medieval communities were based on practical observation of how human activities affected the natural world. Regulations about waste disposal, water quality, and resource conservation weren't based on sophisticated ecological theory but on generations of experience about what practices led to prosperity and what practices led to problems. Communities learned through trial and error that fouling water sources led to disease, that overharvesting forests led to shortages, that poor soil management led to crop failures. Laws governing religious practice in medieval communities had to balance spiritual needs with practical concerns. While religious observance was considered essential for both individual salvation and community welfare, the laws recognized that people had different levels of understanding and commitment. Regulations focused on maintaining basic standards of conduct rather than enforcing perfect orthodoxy. The goal was to preserve community harmony and ensure that religious obligations didn't interfere unnecessarily with economic and social life. The treatment of animals in medieval law reflects both practical and ethical considerations. Working animals like horses and oxen were valuable property that had to be protected from abuse and overwork. But the laws also showed genuine concern for animal welfare, recognizing that unnecessary cruelty was both economically wasteful and morally wrong. Hunting laws protected both animal populations and property rights while ensuring that communities could supplement their diet with wild game when necessary. In the profound stillness of deep night, when even the town watch moves quietly through sleeping streets, your contemplation of medieval law reaches deeper levels of understanding. The darkness outside these ancient walls is not empty but full of presence, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who faced the same fundamental challenges of living together in peace, creating justice from imperfection, and finding meaning in the complex dance of human community. Allow your awareness to sink into this meditative state, as if you were a monk in a candlelit cell, copying manuscripts that contain not just legal procedures but profound insights into the nature of human societies. Each law you contemplate reveals layers of meaning, like a deep well that reflects different images depending on the angle of the light. The surface shows practical regulations, but deeper down lie universal truths about forgiveness, responsibility, compassion, and the eternal human struggle to create order without destroying freedom. The medieval understanding of justice was fundamentally restorative rather than punitive. When someone committed a crime or violated community standards, the primary goal wasn't to inflict suffering but to repair the damage and restore relationships. This approach recognized that communities were small and interdependent, they couldn't afford to lose productive members through execution or exile except in the most extreme cases. Laws governing compensation, public penance, and community service were designed to heal wounds rather than simply punish wrongdoing. The concept of sanctuary in medieval law reveals profound understanding of human nature and divine mercy. Churches and other sacred spaces provided refuge for those fleeing justice, but this wasn't simply an escape from consequences. The sanctuary laws required wrongdoers to confront their actions in a spiritual context, to seek forgiveness from both God and community, and to find ways to make amends that went beyond simple legal penalties. The system recognized that some crimes sprang from desperation or temporary madness, and that genuine repentance deserved a chance for redemption. Laws governing the treatment of prisoners and those awaiting trial show both the limitations and the aspirations of medieval justice. Physical conditions in medieval jails were often harsh by our standards, but the legal principles governing imprisonment were surprisingly humane. Prisoners retained certain rights, to food, to visits from family and clergy, to legal representation of sorts. The wealthy couldn't simply buy their way out of serious charges, but poverty wasn't supposed to prevent access to justice. These principles weren't always honored, but their existence shows that medieval society aspired to fairness even when it couldn't always achieve it. The role of community witnesses in medieval legal proceedings reflects deep understanding of how truth is established and justice is perceived. Trials weren't abstract proceedings conducted by professional legal experts but community events where neighbors evaluated evidence and testimony based on their knowledge of the people involved. This system had obvious limitations, but it also ensured that legal decisions took into account the full context of people's lives and relationships. Justice wasn't just about applying rules but about understanding how those rules affected real people in specific circumstances. Medieval laws governing charity and the treatment of the poor show sophisticated understanding of both individual responsibility and social obligation. Communities were expected to care for their own needy members, but individuals were also required to contribute to this care according to their abilities. The laws recognized that poverty could result from circumstances beyond individual control, illness, injury, crop failure, economic disruption, and that society had an obligation to provide support. At the same time, the laws tried to distinguish between deserving poor who couldn't work and those who chose not to work. The regulation of markets and trade in medieval communities was based on principles that seem remarkably modern in some ways. The concept of just price wasn't government price control but recognition that purely market-driven pricing could lead to exploitation and social instability. Laws governing weights and measures, quality standards, and fair dealing practices were designed to create trust between buyers and sellers. The elaborate guild systems weren't just economic cartels but institutions that balanced competition with cooperation, innovation with stability. Laws governing women's property rights in medieval society were more complex and varied than popular stereotypes suggest. While married women's legal status was generally subordinate to their husbands, the laws also protected women's economic interests in various ways. Dower rights ensured that widows would have support after their husbands' deaths. Inheritance laws often protected daughters' interests even when sons were preferred. Some communities allowed women to engage in certain trades independently, especially in areas like brewing, textile work, and retail trade. The treatment of children in medieval law reflects both protective instincts and practical necessities. While children were expected to contribute to family economic life from an early age, laws also protected them from exploitation and abuse. Apprenticeship regulations ensured that young people received proper training and treatment. Inheritance laws protected children's interests while recognizing parents' rights to dispose of their property. The laws governing orphans and abandoned children show genuine concern for child welfare, even when the solutions available were limited. Environmental regulations in medieval communities were based on practical observation of how human activities affected natural resources. Laws governing forest use balanced individual rights to gather fuel and building materials with community needs to preserve these resources for the future. Water rights systems ensured that essential resources were shared fairly while preventing pollution and overuse. Agricultural regulations promoted sustainable farming practices that would maintain soil fertility over generations. The regulation of religious and cultural minorities in medieval society varied greatly depending on time and place, but some general principles can be identified. Communities generally tolerated diversity as long as it didn't threaten social stability or challenge fundamental shared values. Jewish communities, for example, were often granted protection and certain privileges in exchange for valuable economic services, though they also faced restrictions and persecution. The treatment of heretics and religious dissidents was often harsh, but even here the preferred solution was usually conversion rather than elimination. Laws governing hospitality and the treatment of travelers reflect both practical concerns and deeply held values. Communities had obligations to provide shelter and food to travelers in need, especially during harsh weather or other emergencies. These obligations weren't just legal requirements but expressions of shared humanity and recognition that anyone might someday find themselves in need of assistance from strangers. At the same time, communities had to protect themselves from those who might abuse hospitality or bring danger to local residents. The medieval understanding of mental capacity and legal responsibility was primitive by modern standards but showed genuine attempts to balance individual accountability with recognition of human limitations. Laws governing contracts made by those with limited mental capacity tried to prevent exploitation while allowing people to manage their own affairs as much as possible. The treatment of crimes committed by those with mental illness attempted to balance public safety with recognition that not all wrongdoing deserved the same level of punishment. As the deep hours of night embrace our medieval town in profound tranquility, your contemplation reaches toward the transcendent wisdom embedded in these ancient legal traditions. The darkness outside is complete now, broken only by the soft glow of carefully tended watch fires and the occasional flicker of lamplight in windows where someone tends to the sick or studies sacred texts. In this deep stillness, the laws you've been contemplating reveal their most profound meanings, not as mere regulations but as expressions of humanity's eternal quest to create harmony from discord, to find justice within imperfection, to build communities that honor both individual dignity and collective welfare. Let your consciousness settle into this transcendent state of understanding, as if you were a contemplative scholar in a great cathedral library, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The legal codes before you dissolve into something deeper, patterns of human behavior, aspirations for justice, dreams of peace, the eternal struggle between what is and what ought to be. You begin to see how these medieval laws were not arbitrary impositions but organic expressions of communities trying to live according to their highest ideals while acknowledging their human limitations. The concept of the king's peace in medieval law represents humanity's eternal longing for a realm where justice reigns and conflict ceases. This wasn't just a legal fiction but a spiritual aspiration, the idea that human authority could create spaces where divine justice manifested in earthly institutions. Laws governing sanctuary, safe conduct, and protection of the innocent weren't just practical measures but expressions of faith that peace was possible, that chaos could be transformed into order, that even flawed human institutions could serve transcendent purposes. The elaborate systems of oaths and sworn testimony in medieval legal proceedings reveal deep understanding of the sacred nature of truth-telling. When someone swore on the Bible or took an oath before God and these witnesses, they weren't just following legal procedures but participating in a sacred drama where human justice intersected with divine truth. The solemnity of these oaths reflected recognition that legal proceedings were more than practical problem-solving. They were moral exercises where the integrity of individuals and communities was tested and either strengthened or weakened. Laws governing pilgrimage and religious travel show medieval society's understanding that spiritual quests sometimes required temporary suspension of ordinary social obligations. Pilgrims were granted special protection not just because they were harmless travelers but because their journeys represented humanity's search for meaning and redemption. The legal privileges granted to pilgrims reflected recognition that some human activities transcended immediate practical concerns and served higher purposes that benefited entire communities even when they seemed economically unproductive. The medieval institution of chivalry, with its elaborate legal codes governing knightly conduct, represents humanity's attempt to transform violence into service, power into protection, strength into virtue. The laws of chivalry weren't just rules for a military elite but expressions of moral ideals that influenced broader social behavior. The concepts of honor, courtesy, and protection of the weak that were embodied in chivalric law reflected deeper aspirations about how human beings should treat one another, especially when relationships involved significant imbalances of power. Guild laws governing craftsmanship reveal understanding that work could be more than mere survival activity. It could be a form of spiritual practice, a way of serving community, an expression of human creativity and dignity. The elaborate regulations governing apprenticeship, quality standards, and fair dealing weren't just economic arrangements but systems for transmitting not just technical skills but moral values. The guild oath that bound craftsmen to honest work and fair dealing reflected recognition that economic activity was also moral activity that could either strengthen or weaken the fabric of community life. Laws governing marriage and family life in medieval society show attempts to create legal frameworks that could honor both romantic love and practical necessity, individual choice and family obligation, spiritual ideals and economic realities. The elaborate regulations governing courtship, marriage ceremonies, and family responsibilities weren't attempts to destroy spontaneity and affection but efforts to create stable contexts where love could flourish and children could be raised successfully. The legal protections for wives, children, and elderly family members reflected understanding that families needed more than affection to function, they needed clear expectations and enforceable obligations. The treatment of debt and economic obligation in medieval law reveals attempts to balance individual freedom with social responsibility, present needs with future security, compassion with accountability. Usury laws weren't just economic regulations but expressions of moral vision, the idea that human relationships shouldn't be reduced to purely commercial calculations, that the strong had obligations to the weak, that communities had interests in preventing the kind of economic exploitation that could destroy social cohesion. Laws governing festivals and celebrations show understanding that communities needed more than efficient production and orderly governance, they needed joy, beauty, shared meaning, opportunities for transcendence. The elaborate regulations governing religious festivals, seasonal celebrations, and community gatherings weren't attempts to suppress spontaneity but efforts to ensure that celebration served its proper purposes of strengthening community bonds, expressing shared values, and providing respite from the ordinary struggles of daily life. The medieval approach to conflict resolution, with its emphasis on mediation, compensation, and public reconciliation, represents sophisticated understanding of how human communities heal from internal wounds. The preference for restorative rather than punitive justice reflected recognition that punishment alone rarely resolves the underlying problems that lead to conflict. The elaborate procedures for public confession, apology, and reconciliation weren't just legal formalities but therapeutic processes designed to restore relationships and prevent future conflicts. Laws governing the protection of sacred spaces and religious observances reflect understanding that communities needed contact with the transcendent to maintain their moral orientation. Sanctuary laws, prohibitions against violence in churches, and protections for religious ceremonies weren't just about maintaining public order but about preserving spaces where divine presence could be encountered and moral transformation could occur. These laws recognized that purely secular communities, however well organized, couldn't satisfy humanity's deepest needs for meaning and purpose. The treatment of learning and scholarship in medieval law shows understanding that communities needed more than practical skills to flourish, they needed wisdom, cultural continuity, intellectual growth. Laws protecting scholars, regulating schools, and governing the transmission of knowledge weren't just about education in the narrow sense but about preserving and developing the intellectual and cultural resources that allowed communities to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. Environmental laws in medieval communities reveal understanding that human welfare was intimately connected to the health of the natural world. Regulations governing forest use, water rights, and agricultural practices weren't based on modern ecological theory but on practical observation that communities prospered when they lived in harmony with natural systems and suffered when they exploited those systems unsustainably. These laws reflected recognition that human communities were part of larger created order that deserved respect and careful stewardship. As the medieval night reaches its deepest point, somewhere in those quiet hours between midnight and dawn when time seems suspended and the boundary between sleeping and waking becomes soft and permeable, your contemplation of these ancient laws begins to transform into something even more profound. The harsh edges of legal analysis dissolve into a gentler understanding, like morning mist rising from a peaceful river. The laws themselves seem to breathe with ancient wisdom, their practical purposes giving way to deeper rhythms of rest, restoration, and the eternal human need for peace. Allow yourself to settle even more deeply into this contemplative state, as if you were resting in the guest chamber of a monastery where generations of pilgrims have found sanctuary from the troubles of the world. The stone walls around you have absorbed centuries of prayer, meditation, and peaceful slumber. The wooden floor has been worn smooth by countless footsteps of those seeking refuge, understanding, and rest. The very air seems suffused with tranquility, carrying whispers of ancient chants and the gentle breathing of countless souls who have found peace in this sacred space. The nighttime laws of medieval communities were designed with profound understanding of human need for rest and restoration. Curfew regulations weren't harsh restrictions but gentle protections, ensuring that those who had worked hard during the day could sleep without disturbance. The requirement that taverns close at reasonable hours wasn't moral oppression but recognition that communities needed periods of quiet for reflection, family time, and the simple restoration that comes from peaceful evenings. Even the regulations governing nighttime work acknowledged that while some activities couldn't stop completely, the care of sick people, the tending of animals, the protection of the community, most labor should cease to allow for proper rest. The laws governing sleep and rest reveal medieval society's understanding that these weren't merely biological necessities but spiritual requirements. Sabbath regulations and feast day observances weren't just religious obligations but recognition that humans needed regular periods of renewal, reflection, and connection with higher purposes. The protection of sleep through noise regulations and curfew laws reflected understanding that rest was a fundamental human right that communities had obligations to protect. The provision of shelter for travelers wasn't just hospitality but recognition that everyone deserved a safe place to sleep. Medieval laws governing dreams and their interpretation show fascinating insight into the mystery of sleep and consciousness. While these laws seem strange to modern minds, they reflected genuine understanding that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness was permeable and significant. Laws governing the reporting of prophetic dreams, the treatment of those who experienced visions during sleep, and the role of dream interpretation in legal proceedings acknowledged that human consciousness operated in ways that purely rational analysis couldn't fully explain. The treatment of nighttime activities in medieval law reveals sophisticated understanding of how darkness changes human behavior and community dynamics. Laws governing nighttime travel acknowledged both the practical difficulties and the increased dangers of moving through the world after dark. Regulations about night markets and evening entertainment balanced people's need for fellowship and commerce with the community's need for peace and security. Even the laws governing nighttime religious observances, like midnight masses and dawn prayers, showed understanding that some spiritual experiences required the special qualities of quiet and darkness. Laws governing the care of the sick during night hours reveal profound compassion and practical wisdom. Communities recognized that illness often intensified during dark hours, that the sick needed constant attention, and that those who provided care during the night deserved special support and protection. Regulations ensured that physicians and healers would be available during night emergencies, that families had resources to provide nighttime care, and that the community would support those whose illnesses required extended nighttime attention. The medieval understanding of hospitality laws shows deep appreciation for the vulnerability of those seeking shelter and rest. Innkeepers and householders who provided lodging weren't just running businesses but fulfilling sacred obligations to protect the defenseless. Laws governing the treatment of guests weren't just commercial regulations but moral codes that recognized the sacred trust involved when someone placed themselves under another's protection during their most vulnerable hours of sleep. Nighttime property laws in medieval communities balanced individual rights with community security needs. While property owners had the right to protect their possessions, they also had obligations not to create unnecessary dangers for nighttime travelers. Regulations about lighting, the maintenance of roads and pathways, and the securing of potentially dangerous animals or structures showed understanding that individual property rights had to be balanced with broader community welfare, especially during hours when people's ability to protect themselves was limited. The laws governing nighttime religious observances reveal understanding that spiritual life required both communal and solitary experiences. While communities gathered for evening prayers and occasional nighttime services, individuals were also protected in their right to private devotion during quiet hours. Regulations about bells and other sound signals acknowledged that religious communities needed ways to coordinate their spiritual activities without disturbing those who sought rest or private prayer. Medieval laws about storytelling and evening entertainment show appreciation for the human need for narrative, imagination, and shared meaning-making during the transition from waking activity to sleep. Regulations governing traveling entertainers, the telling of stories in taverns and homes, and the singing of songs during evening gatherings weren't just about public order but about protecting the cultural activities that helped communities process their experiences and prepare for rest. The treatment of children's bedtime routines in medieval law reveals understanding that young people needed special protection and preparation for sleep. Laws governing child labor ensured that children finished their work early enough to have proper rest. Regulations about family obligations included requirements that parents provide not just physical care but emotional security for children during vulnerable night hours. Even laws governing children's religious education acknowledged that evening prayers and bedtime stories played important roles in helping young people develop the inner resources they would need to navigate life's challenges. Laws governing the protection of sleeping people reveal profound respect for human vulnerability and the sacred nature of rest. Regulations about entering homes at night, disturbing sleepers, and providing security during dark hours weren't just about preventing crime but about protecting the fundamental human right to peaceful rest. Communities understood that sleep was a time when people were defenseless and that this vulnerability created special obligations for protection and care. The medieval approach to nighttime conflict resolution shows understanding that darkness changes the nature of human interactions and that different approaches were needed for problems that arose during evening and night hours. Laws encouraged the postponement of serious disputes until daylight, when clearer thinking and calmer emotions were more likely. Regulations about nighttime gatherings and meetings acknowledged that important decisions were better made when people were well rested and could see each other clearly.